Her rap on the door was purely for survival. He unlatched it simply to endure another quiet night. However, destiny charted a different course. Eliza and Jonas, once unacquainted individuals linked by grief, were thrust by jeopardy into becoming something more profound. Not merely survivors, not solely protectors. They became a family. The wind shrieked through the glen as if it were an injured animal. The snow now drove horizontally, cutting through the fading daylight and consuming all in its way. There were no paths, no guides, only an endless expanse of white. Eliza Cooper drew her shawl more snugly around her shoulders, yet the thin wool offered scant defense against the chill that bit into her very core. Alongside her, three little forms plodded silently, their heads bowed, their faces concealed by scarves and old hats. Nathan, at 10 years of age the eldest, held his jaw rigidly, determined not to display any frailty. Laya, just shy of 8, held fast to his arm, her pace becoming increasingly unsteady as time wore on. And Ben, dear gentle Ben, merely 5, whimpered quietly while clutching his mother's dress, his small mittens frozen solid. Eliza's legs ached with a burning sensation. Each time she urged them onward in a whisper, her lips split. She had no idea how much longer they could endure. She doubted her own ability to continue, yet she knew she could not halt. She would not. Not after Matthew. Not after his parting words as he departed, abandoning them at Bitter Hollow with only half a bag of flour and his mocking remark, "You'll manage, Eliza. You always do." His voice echoed in her mind even in the darkness. The sting of betrayal remained fresh from the moment she understood he hadn't merely gone for provisions. He had departed permanently. Thus, she pressed on through the tempest, through the pain, through the oppressive quiet, until she spotted it. A glimmer. It wavered weakly afar, partially obscured by restless pines and a dense veil of snow. A small house. Eliza felt her knees give way from relief, but she compelled herself to stand. "Keep moving," she rasped to the children. "Only a bit farther." They staggered the final 100 yards as a group, falling against the entrance. Eliza's knuckles were insensate when she lifted her hand to rap on the door. One knock, a second, a third, silence. She rapped once more with greater force. Her voice failed when she attempted to shout, only a hoarse sound emerging from her throat. At last the door groaned ajar. A figure of a man was framed in the opening, silhouetted by the glow of a fire behind him. He possessed a tall, wide-shouldered build, a substantial coat draped loosely on his form. His countenance was etched with distinct lines, his beard flecked with gray. Yet it was his eyes that caught Eliza's attention, chilly, fatigued, and worn. For a lengthy moment he remained silent. She too said nothing. Utterances were superfluous. Not with 3 frost-bitten children clutching their mother's dress, trembling uncontrollably. The man's jaw tightened. He moved to one side. "Enter." Eliza showed no reluctance. She guided the children indoors, almost having to pull Ben over the doorstep. The door banged closed after them, shutting out the wind's shriek. A surge of warmth enveloped them. They heard the fire crackling in the hearth and smelled the subtle aroma of pine and smoke. The man acted quickly, drawing seats nearer to the flames. "Be seated. Warm yourselves." Eliza complied, removing scarves and taking off the rigid coats from her children's small frames. Nathan assisted Leia, chafing her arms as Ben snuggled deep into Eliza's embrace. The man vanished into an adjacent room, reappearing shortly with heavy blankets and a kettle. "Consume this," he instructed, decanting steaming water into well-used mugs. "It isn't much, but it's superior to the cold." Eliza accepted the cup with gratitude, her numb fingers encircling it as she covertly observed their host. He moved with the air of someone unaccustomed to visitors. His entire demeanor, from the set of his jaw to the clomp of his boots on the wooden floor, bespoke a life of solitude. Nevertheless, he had not refused them entry. "My thanks," Eliza articulated, her voice strained from the wind and apprehension. The man merely grunted. He poked the fire, causing embers to fly up the flue. "Have you traveled a great distance?" he inquired, at last disrupting the profound stillness. Eliza paused, yet something in his unwavering demeanor, the manner in which he refrained from pressing, prompted her to respond. 3 days, she uttered quietly. East of Bitter Hollow. The wagon failed. We walked the remainder of the way. The man showed no reaction. For what reason? The inquiry struck with more force than she anticipated. Simple and direct. She gulped, her gaze shifting to her children, who were now clustered and nearly asleep by the fireplace. He left, she stated finally. I had no choice. That appeared to satisfy him. He abstained from prying further. Instead, he gave a slight nod and leaned his back against the table, his arms folded. The name is Jonas Hale, he volunteered after a moment. Eliza Cooper, she answered softly. She looked towards the children. Nathan, Leah, Ben. Jonas acknowledged them with another nod. His expression stayed neutral, but his look softened somewhat as he observed Ben's little hand grasping the hem of his mother's skirt, even in slumber. You are secure in this place, Jonas stated in a low voice. The tempest has nowhere to vent its fury tonight, and neither do you. Relief struck Eliza with such intensity she nearly broke down in tears, but she maintained her composure. She always had. Instead, she met his gaze and murmured, I thank you. Jonas merely shifted his attention back to the fire, his form faintly illuminated by the dancing flames. Externally, the storm raged against the cabin's structure. Yet inside, for the first occasion in what seemed an eternity, Eliza and her offspring were, for the moment, safe. Dawn arrived gradually. The blizzard had not entirely ceased, merely abated. Its roar was now a muted hiss, like a serpent coiled beyond the walls, anticipating a sign of vulnerability. Eliza was the first to awaken. Her spine was sore from maintaining an upright position near the hearth while sleeping, but her gaze immediately fell upon the children. Nathan, Leah, and Ben remained enveloped in the borrowed coverings, their complexions now rosy from warmth instead of chill. Ben's small hand rested gently upon Leah's shoulder, and Nathan had shifted during the night to nestle protectively around them both. They were out of harm's way for now. Eliza got up with care, her limbs unyielding, and surveyed the cabin. The dwelling was modest, but showed signs of tending. Implements were arranged orderly along one wall. A shelf holding books, well read but neat, was positioned near the entrance. The table bore the marks of long use but was spotless. She located Jonas outdoors. He was on the porch, axe in hand, splitting kindling with clean, expert strokes. Light snow continued to fall, settling on his shoulders, but he ignored it. Eliza paused, then came outside, pulling her shawl close. You needn't go to all that trouble for us, she remarked quietly. Jonas did not turn to her as he answered. Not doing it on your account, he stated bluntly. Doing it for the stove. The stove doesn't distinguish who is famished. It just requires fuel to ignite. Eliza suppressed a smile. She knew his sort. Men who concealed their benevolence behind gruff speech and calloused hands. Still, she refrained from insisting. Instead, she descended from the porch and started to gather the cleft wood in her arms. Jonas stopped, observing her. Could have remained indoors, he commented. I've been idle too long, Eliza answered simply. It is better to be active. He gave a single nod, a tacit sign of agreement. Together they toiled, speaking little, as there was no need for words. By the time the woodpile was restocked, the sky had brightened to a muted silver. Jonas gestured with his chin towards the door. The coffee is likely still hot. Indoors, the children had started to awaken. Nathan yawned and extended his limbs. Leah sat upright, rubbing the drowsiness from her eyes. Ben clutched the quilt, peering out with caution. Jonas poured coffee into 2 metal cups, black, sharp, and steaming. Eliza accepted hers with gratitude, cupping her chilled fingers around its warmth. Are you intending to depart when the storm subsides? He inquired after a brief pause. Eliza faltered. I am unsure. I believed I would. I had relatives to the west, or so I thought, but correspondence ceased long before winter arrived. Jonas did not press her. Instead, he merely nodded and drank his coffee. You are not the first to pass through here believing the West held all the solutions, he remarked quietly. Usually, all one discovers out there is just a greater number of questions. Eliza met his gaze across the expanse of the table. For a brief instant, a silent understanding passed between them. In a sense, they were both like phantoms, individuals the world had left in its wake. As the day progressed, the children grew more at ease. Nathan assisted Jonas with the livestock, moving hay and breaking ice in the water container. Jonas demonstrated how to grip the axe, how to swing it efficiently. Leia remained inside, aiding Eliza in mending torn mittens and making a watery stew. She posed quiet inquiries about Jonas, why he dwelt alone, why he lacked a family. Ben shadowed Jonas constantly. The young boy posed ceaseless questions, his voice small yet keen. What is that knife utilized for? Do bears frequent this area? Might I possess a horse one day? Jonas commendably addressed each and every one. Nay, he responded at one juncture, indicating the firearm suspended near the door. That is for bears. Knives are for wood, or unyielding knots. By dusk, a change had occurred within the cabin. The quietude was no longer oppressive. It felt natural, accustomed. The children chortled softly as they engaged in play near the fire. Eliza smiled while she mixed the stew, glancing occasionally at Jonas, who was occupied carving a small wooden object. A bird, finely wrought and exact. She observed the motion of his hands, unhurried and meticulous, as if he were shaping something more than mere timber. You possess skill in carving, she commented softly. Jonas looked up. It's a way to pass the time when the wind refuses to cease its howling. Eliza regarded him for another moment. I believe, she started cautiously, you are more compassionate than you reveal. Jonas did not grin, not precisely, but a slight quiver touched his lips, and that in itself seemed a small triumph. Night descended, heavy and unhurried. Following supper, the children once more curled up close to the hearth, already mostly asleep. Eliza and Jonas occupied the table, the lamp casting a gentle golden radiance between them. Outside, the storm had diminished, yet the cold continued to bear down on the window panes. Eliza's fingers tightened around her cup as she gazed into the dancing shadows. I thank you, she uttered suddenly, her voice low yet firm. Jonas lifted an eyebrow. For what reason? For permitting our stay, for refraining from too many inquiries. Jonas averted his gaze, his attention settling on the slumbering children. It didn't appear you required more questions, he murmured. It seemed you needed respite. Eliza felt a knot of tension ease within her. I did, she whispered. For a time, quietude settled once more. Not burdensome, not vacant, simply comfortable. Jonas stood, stretching his broad frame. The storm is abating, he remarked. Tomorrow you may depart if you so choose. Eliza nodded slowly, yet the notion caused a tightening in her stomach. Depart. Re-enter a world that had left her bruised and solitary. Or remain. But that consideration was for another evening. For the present, they were secure. For the present, the fire burned consistently. And for the first time in a very long while, Eliza Cooper let herself entertain the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this safety was not merely fleeting after all. Dawn arrived with a faint, hesitant illumination. For the first time in several days, the sky was devoid of snow. It hung heavy and gray. Yet it remained clear. The tempest had concluded. Jonas Hale stepped onto the porch, his boots making a soft crunch on the crusted snow. He could detect a shift in the atmosphere. Not merely spring attempting to emerge from winter's grasp, but something different. Inside, Eliza and the children were already moving about. Nathan was gathering the quilts, keen to assist. Leia sat fashioning braids in her doll's yarn hair, humming softly. Ben followed Jonas everywhere that morning, inquiring about the animals, the trees, about existence beyond the snow. It felt ordinary, excessively ordinary. Jonas had learned not to rely on what seemed ordinary. By midday, Eliza stood in the entrance, wiping her hands on her skirt, her gaze fixed on the distant ridge where the path vanished into the pines. Do you believe it is safe at this time? She inquired gently. Jonas did not reply immediately. He lowered his axe, wiping perspiration and frost from his forehead. Safety isn't a gift from the land, he stated after a pause, but it is tranquil. That holds some value. Eliza nodded, though uncertainty shadowed her features. For a period, they labored alongside one another. Jonas mended a fence rail damaged by the heavy snowfall. Eliza swept the cabin, humming softly while the children played in the vicinity. There was an air of settledness, of being rooted, and it was then that the sound arose. Hoofbeats. Jonas was the first to hear them, the consistent, unhurried rhythm of horses. Not galloping, not speeding, just assured. He emerged from the barn, his eyes narrowing towards the trail. A rider appeared from the edge of the trees, tall, slender, and attired in a dark wool coat too refined for this region. A second followed, then a third. The lead man doffed his hat, showing sleekly combed hair and a self-satisfied, recognizable smirk. Jonas identified his sword at once. Not a wanderer, not a desperado, something more sinister. A man who believed law and authority were his inherent right. "Good afternoon," the man called out, his voice as smooth as river stones. Jonas offered no response. Behind him, he detected the creak of the cabin door opening. Eliza emerged, instinctively wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the men and became still. Her complexion turned ashen. "Matthew," she whispered. Jonas had no need to inquire. He understood. The man dismounted with slow confidence, his boots pressing into the snow and mire. He removed his gloves with a display of casual indifference. "Greetings, Eliza," Matthew Crowley drawled. "It has been a lengthy journey to find you." Eliza moved nearer to Jonas, instinctively positioning herself between Matthew and her children. "What is your purpose here?" Her voice was faint yet resolute. Matthew's smile broadened, though it did not extend to his eyes. "Come now, no greeting for your spouse? You ceased to be that when you abandoned us to perish in Bitter Hollow." Matthew made a tisking sound, shaking his head as a parent might chide a recalcitrant child. "Come now, my dear, let us not be overly dramatic. I have had occasion to think, to ponder. It is evident that you and the children require suitable supervision, order, a man's influence to direct matters." Jonas grew rigid, his jaw clenching. "This is not your domain," he stated flatly. Matthew's gaze shifted indolently towards Jonas, appraising him. "And who might you be? The individual under whose roof they reside?" Matthew let out a low, malicious chuckle. "Well, isn't that quite convenient? A widow takes shelter with an unfamiliar man in the wilderness. Truly wholesome." Jonas did not recoil. "You left them to face death. I did not." Matthew's facade of charm fractured, his lips contorting. "I am here to retrieve what belongs to me. I have already conferred with the sheriff in Glenrock. I am their father by kinship and by legal standing." Eliza's composure wavered slightly at the mention of the law. Jonas could perceive her fear, not for her own sake, but for her children. Matthew noticed it as well, and he capitalized on it. "I shall return on the morrow," he announced casually, as if speaking of the weather. "You may have this evening to bid your farewells, but be under no illusion, Eliza. They are departing with me. Court directives are not lenient towards women who abscond." He remounted his horse, giving a single nod to his companions. The trio turned and rode away, leaving behind disturbed snow and a heavy silence. That evening the cabin was like a sepulchre filled with quiet apprehension. The children had overheard everything. Nathan sat rigidly by the hearth, attempting to conceal his fear, but unsuccessfully. Leia clung to Eliza, quietly asking if their departure was imminent. Ben simply wept softly into his sister's lap. Eliza paced the confined space, wringing her hands until they were sore. "What course of action am I to take?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "He has the backing of the law. He possesses wealth. I cannot contend with that." Jonas sat at the table, gazing intently at the flames. "You need not face it by yourself," he stated plainly. Eliza ceased her pacing, regarding him with eyes reddened from weeping. "What is your meaning?" Jonas leaned in, his voice low and assured. I have encountered men of his kind previously. They believe documents and intimidation render them invulnerable. But this area, this community, they have observed who you are, what you have accomplished. You have kept these children alive. You have established something here. He is relying on frightening you into silence. He rose slowly, his shoulders set. But we shall not remain silent. Not tomorrow. Not when he arrives expecting capitulation. Eliza looked at him, tears on her eyelashes. And if he compels them to take the children? Jonas answered without pause. Then he will have to remove them from my grasp. The fire popped loudly, scattering embers. For a considerable time, Eliza remained quiet. Then, unhurriedly, she moved forward, nearer than she had ever ventured before. She extended her hand, placing it gently on Jonas's arm. You would undertake that for us? Jonas glanced down at her hand, then met her eyes again. For kin, he said softly, I would do more. Eliza did not weep, not on this occasion. Instead, she gave a single firm and decisive nod. Then we make our stand together. Outside, the frigid wind murmured through the trees, but within, two individuals, fractured and mended, had just established a boundary in the snow. And by daybreak, Matthew Crowley would discover precisely what that signified. Morning arrived with a sharpness like a razor's edge. The sun ascended, pale and frigid, throwing long shadows across the snow-laden hills. It ought to have signaled a new beginning, a day of thaw and potential. But for Eliza Cooper and Jonas Hale, it felt more akin to the calm before an approaching tempest. Matthew Crowley would reappear. He had stated his intention to return, and men of his ilk did not make empty threats. Not when self-esteem and dominion were at stake. Inside the cabin, Eliza dressed her children with care. Nathan was subdued, his jaw set firmly. Leah inquired if they were obliged to depart. Ben, too young to grasp the situation fully, clung to his mother with wide, bewildered eyes. You are not departing from here, Eliza murmured to them as she smoothed Leah's hair, compelling composure into her tone. Regardless of what that man asserts. Jonas was outdoors before sunrise. He labored with deliberate intent, felling timber, inspecting his firearm, fortifying the cabin's main entrance. He was not gearing up for a conflict. Not precisely. But neither did he intend to retreat. By the time noon arrived, the atmosphere was dense with tension, like thick smoke. And then they registered it. Horses. Not solely Matthew this time. He had brought associates. 4 riders became visible as the children gathered near the window. Jonas stood on the porch, arms folded, as Matthew dismounted with studied slowness. His smirk was more pronounced today, self-assured. Behind him rode Sheriff Tate, a man known in this region for keeping to himself as long as his finances remained sound. Matthew strode forward arrogantly, as if he already held title to the ground beneath his footwear. Eliza, he called, his voice loud enough for the entire clearing to perceive. I am present as I vowed. It is time to bring my children to their home. Eliza materialized in the doorway, her posture erect, shoulders squared despite the unsteadiness in her fingers. They are at home, she stated resolutely. Matthew's smile diminished. Let us avoid making this unpleasant. Sheriff Tate possesses the documents. Custody affirmed and authorized. I am acting within my entitlements. Sheriff Tate produced a creased piece of paper and read from it, his voice flat and perfunctory. Eliza Cooper, you are herewith directed to surrender the children into the keeping of their father, Matthew Crowley. Failure to acquiesce. That is sufficient, Jonas cut in, his voice low but resonant with authority. All gazes shifted to him. Jonas advanced, positioning himself squarely between Matthew and the cabin. I am aware of your nature, Crowley, Jonas declared evenly. A man who abandoned his family to perish in the winter, a man who regards people as possessions, but not in this place, not any longer. Matthew's eyes narrowed. You have no say in this matter, Hale. The law does. Jonas remained steadfast. The law may be indifferent to your identity, but this community is not. As if by prearrangement, voices emanated from beyond the tree line. Mrs. Webb, Pastor Connor, old Doc Briggs. They approached on foot, wrapped warmly against the cold, their expressions conveying quiet determination. Following them were other townspeople. Individuals who had observed Eliza in recent months witnessed her reconstruct something delicate yet tangible. "We align ourselves with her," Mrs. Webb stated simply, moving to stand beside Jonas. Pastor Connor nodded in agreement. "She nurtured those children with dignity when no one else would." Matthew's self-assurance wavered. "This is not your concern," he retorted sharply. "It is now," Jonas declared, his tone calm but deadly certain. The sheriff fidgeted uncomfortably. "Crowley, this document is only effective if individuals are prepared to uphold it." Matthew's countenance darkened, his gaze darting between the assembling crowd and the unyielding figure of Jonas Hale. "Do you believe this is concluded?" he hissed. "Do you believe a handful of farmers and widows can obstruct me?" "I believe you are already obstructed," Jonas answered. A heavy silence descended. Matthew's air of confidence shattered entirely. With a bitter imprecation, he thrust the documents back into the sheriff's grasp and strode back towards his mount. "This is not the conclusion," he called out over his shoulder. "No," Jonas concurred softly. "It is the commencement." Matthew departed, vanquished but still a potential threat. The sheriff paused, then trailed after him. The lawman's bearing slumped as he comprehended the prevailing sentiment. The townsfolk tarried, offering Eliza gentle words and warm smiles before returning to their dwellings. They did not engage in celebration. There was no necessity. They had appeared when it was crucial. That sufficed. Inside the cabin, the tension dissipated like ice cracking underfoot. Eliza stood by the window, observing the last of the riders vanish over the ridge. Her hands shook, but not from apprehension. Jonas approached her, standing close enough for her to sense the warmth emanating from his chest. "He will return," she remarked softly. "Perhaps," Jonas conceded, "but so shall we, each day for as long as necessary." She then looked at him. "Truly?" Looked. And something within her yielded, not in fear, but in relief. She drew nearer, her head resting gently against his shoulder. "You are not obliged to defend us," she whispered. Jonas turned slightly, his hand rising to rest tenderly on her back. "I was," he stated simply, "because you are no longer by yourself." For a brief period they stood in the diminishing afternoon glow, not as rescuer and rescued, not as strangers brought together by fate, but as something far more delicate and far more potent: family. Outside, winter clung tenaciously to the periphery of the land. But inside, beside the fire, and amidst the gentle exhalations of sleeping children, Eliza and Jonas stood firm against the tempest. And for the first time in a very long, long while, neither of them experienced the cold. The days that ensued felt more buoyant, not because the menace had disappeared. Matthew Crowley's presence still cast a shadow somewhere beyond the ridge, but because the worst had been averted. The children remained. Eliza remained. And Jonas Hale, who had weathered more winters than he could recall, alone in his cabin with only wood chips and quiet for companionship, was no longer solitary. Spring arrived slowly, but persistently. The snow first receded along the cabin's edges, creating small streams that murmured past the porch. New shoots emerged from the frozen earth, tiny spots of green that Eliza would pause to appreciate each morning. Indoors, merriment returned like a melody forgotten and then rediscovered. Nathan now assisted Jonas with various repairs. The boy's hands, once soft and awkward, gained confidence as he hammered nails and transported wood without needing instruction. Jonas showed him how to tie various knots and maintain tools. Nathan absorbed every piece of information, eager to demonstrate his capabilities. Laya and Ben passed many hours near the stream, collecting smooth pebbles and fashioning garlands of daisies. They accompanied Jonas into the forest one afternoon, and upon their return, Laya displayed a small carving he had crafted for her. A fox, delicate and inquisitive. For Ben, Jonas carved a simple flute. The boy dashed about the yard, producing sharp, joyful sounds, until Eliza laughed with such abandon she had to sit. That sound, her laughter, startled Jonas the first time he heard it. It had been a very long time since this cabin had resonated with anything other than the wind and the creaking of timbers. One evening, Eliza stood by the hearth, dusting flour from her hands after baking bread. Jonas sat close by, honing his knife, though his gaze frequently strayed towards her. The children had been put to bed early, tired out after pursuing fireflies. A stillness hung between them, yet it was not an awkward one. It was filled with anticipation. Eliza finally broke the silence. "They are content here," she remarked softly. Jonas nodded. "They ought to be." Eliza paused, then moved across the room, taking a seat opposite him. She leaned forward slightly, her voice now softer. "But are you?" Jonas ceased his work on the blade. He placed it down with care, then met her gaze. "For a considerable period," he began, his voice husky with a certain tenderness. "This dwelling was quiet because I desired it so. I reasoned, it is better to be solitary than to bear what I have lost." Eliza's eyes softened, and she did not speak. "But then you arrived. You and the others." He gestured towards the rear room from which faint whispers and giggles still emanated through the crevices. "And I came to understand that quietude is not invariably tranquility. At times, it is merely void." Eliza felt a tightness in her throat. "I never intended to remain for such a duration," she confessed. Jonas offered a faint smile. "I never intended to desire your presence." For a moment, the words simply hung in the air, unvarnished and genuine. Eliza reached across the table, her fingers making contact with his. "We possess little," she whispered. Jonas turned his hand, their fingers slowly intertwining. "Is it sufficient?" Eliza's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Do you truly desire our presence here, Jonas? Not merely until springtime, not until the danger subsides, but permanently." Jonas gently pressed her hand. "I already perceive this place differently because of you. I hear it differently. It feels like a home once more." Her breathing hitched. "Then articulate it," she whispered. "If you please." He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice scarcely louder than the crackling fire. "Remain, Eliza. Remain and make this your abode. Make us your family." That was all she required. Her composure broke, tears streaming silently as she stood and moved to bridge the gap between them. Jonas also rose, and before either could utter more, Eliza rested her forehead against his chest, her arms encircling him firmly. Jonas held her, steady and warm, not with craving, not with desperation, but with a sense of promise. The promise of mornings filled with the aroma of baking bread and the sound of children's laughter, of evenings spent by the fire, carving tales into wood and sharing aspirations never voiced before, of family chosen, constructed, and defended. Later that evening, after the fire had dwindled and the children were fast asleep, Nathan stirred. He padded out quietly, discovering Jonas standing by the window, gazing out at the moon-drenched valley. "Jonas?" the boy inquired softly. Jonas turned, taken aback. Nathan paused, shuffling his foot on the floor. "Is it permissible if we consider this our home now?" Jonas swallowed with difficulty, his throat constricting. "Yes, Nathan," he said in a low voice. "It is home now." Nathan nodded, relief smoothing his youthful features. But before he turned to leave, he posed one further question, one that resonated more deeply than Jonas had anticipated. "Is it permissible if I address you by another name as well?" Jonas's chest tightened. "What name is that?" Nathan moved closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Pa." Jonas's breath caught. He uttered no words. He simply reached out and drew the boy into a firm embrace, holding him close as the boy's arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Eliza observed from the doorway, unseen but smiling, her hand resting gently over her heart. Outside, the last vestiges of winter's chill dissipated quietly into the night. And within, the concept of home settled, tangible, and rooted within the walls, the fire, and the beating hearts of those who now shared it. Spring had now fully arrived. The stream behind the cabin sang with increasing volume each day, its icy restraints long vanished. Buds burst forth boldly from trees that had once stood stark, and the meadow grass stretched eagerly towards the expanding sunlight. Yet winter's influence had one final role to enact. It manifested not as blizzards or harsh gales, but in the guise of hoofbeats, steady and recognizable. Jonas Hale recognized the sound even before he witnessed the rider reach the crest of the ridge. Matthew Crowley. On this occasion he rode unaccompanied. No hired enforcers, no corrupt sheriffs, merely a man worn down, his expensive coat begrimed, his arrogance diminished by distance and defeat. Jonas stood on the porch as he approached, his hands resting calmly at his sides. Behind him, the cabin door remained ajar. Eliza was visible inside, composed, unwavering. She did not shrink away this time. Nathan, Leah, and Ben did not conceal themselves either. They stood beside their mother, heads held high, observing. This was their dwelling now, their stronghold. Matthew reined in his horse and dismounted unhurriedly, his boots dragging somewhat through the soft earth, his gait lacking the confident stride it once possessed. Jonas remained silent. There was no need for him to speak. Matthew was the first to break the quiet. "I have come for them," he stated, his voice coarse and hesitant. Jonas arched an eyebrow. "The last I observed. The court rendered that judgment on your behalf." Matthew sneered, though feebly. "Courts are subject to change." "As are individuals," Jonas retorted, his tone cool yet sharp. Matthew's gaze flickered towards Eliza, his jaw tensing. But the fire within him had extinguished. "What is the meaning of this?" "Huh," he uttered with bitterness. "You play at domesticity with my wife, raise my children as if they are your own now." Eliza then stepped forward, calm, determined. "They were never truly yours, Matthew," she declared, her voice cutting more cleanly than any weapon. "You offered them nothing but apprehension. You abandoned them to perish. Jonas provided them with something you were incapable of giving." Matthew scoffed, but his derision was empty. "I was their kin by blood." "Blood?" Jonas interjected, his voice growing stern. "Does not provide warmth at night, does not repair playthings or comfort them when they are unwell." Blood did not instruct Nathan in splitting wood, nor Leah in improving her reading, nor Ben in smiling once more. Matthew stood in silence as the words struck him with greater force than any blow. Behind Jonas, Nathan's voice broke the stillness. "You are not our PA," the boy stated with courage. Leah followed, her small voice unwavering. "Jonas is." Even Ben, clutching shyly to his sister's dress, nodded with gravity. Matthew's shoulders slumped as if the words themselves bore a weight too great to sustain. He looked at Eliza one final time. A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Perhaps remorse, or merely the dawning understanding that what he had forfeited was irretrievable. Without uttering another word, he turned and remounted his horse. This time, as he rode off, he did not glance back, and when he vanished beyond the ridge, it felt different. At last, the final snow had melted. That evening, the cabin radiated a warmth greater than ever before. Jonas sat by the hearth, whittling in silence as the children played nearby. Eliza stood at the stove, stirring stew, her hair unbound and soft around her shoulders. No tempest raged outside, no turmoil remained within. When supper concluded and the children were settled in their shared room, Jonas and Eliza found themselves alone by the fire. For a time, neither spoke. The crackling of the wood and the distant croaking of frogs through the open window were sufficient sound, but eventually Eliza rose from her seat and crossed the room, halting just before Jonas. Her eyes, invariably filled with a certain watchfulness, now held only conviction. "I meant what I declared, you understand," she whispered. Jonas inclined his head slightly. "That this is our dwelling." Eliza nodded, her voice imbued with tenderness and assurance. "Indeed, and not solely due to the structure or the surroundings. Because of you. You supported us when the world sought to crush us. You remained." Jonas put down the piece of wood he held and stood. He reached for her hands, his rough fingers enclosing hers with the naturalness of something always intended to connect. "I was unaware of how much I needed you," he admitted quietly. "All of you." "You have us now," Eliza said, "if you desire our presence." Jonas then smiled, a scarce, subdued smile that extended fully to his eyes. "I desire everything you bring through that doorway each morning, even the commotion, especially the commotion." Eliza leaned upwards, pressing her lips softly against his. No haste, no dramatic display, merely a sense of belonging. When they separated, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath. "I often wondered," she murmured, "if I would ever experience a sense of safety again." Jonas held her more firmly. "You are safe," he vowed, "always." Outside, the final traces of winter melted silently into the soft, receptive earth. Inside, beside the crackling hearth, a man who had once felt empty and a woman who had once been broken stood intertwined, not by happenstance, but by deliberate choice. Love in this place was not demonstrative or swift. It was fashioned slowly, with patient hands, like wood, like trust. And as the night grew deeper and their home stood steadfast around them, Eliza whispered something only Jonas perceived. "We are no longer merely surviving, Jonas. We are living." And for the first time in his existence, Jonas Hale believed her. Not every family is created by birth. Some are formed by choice. What measures would you take to shield yours when the past reappears? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your contributions are valued here. Contributions are valued here. Contributions are valued here. Contributions are valued here. Contributions are valued here.